Hi, for those of us who are joining us for this great event, we are just going to get the Facebook live stream set up and we'll be getting started shortly. Hey, if you're just joining us, we are just getting our Facebook streaming set up. We'll be starting very shortly. Hello, I'm Rebecca Zorno, a Fox Cities Book Festival board member, and I'd like to welcome you to the 14th annual Fox Cities Book Festival and today's event, Reflections on Writing Fictional Pandemics. We're happy to have you here with us virtually today and look forward to gathering in person again next fall. The Fox Cities Book Festival continues to be offered for free to all of our community members. Today's program will be available for viewing after the live event on our Facebook page. The Fox Cities Book Festival is organized by a group of dedicated volunteers and community partners, including public libraries, school districts and universities, bookstores, and individuals giving of their time and talents. We are able to provide these great events without financial barriers, thanks to our generous donors and supporters. They understand the value that access to the arts has on individuals, students, and our greater community. If you think that supporting local writers, building an engaged community of readers, introducing students to authors, and bringing free educational and arts events to our communities is important, we encourage you to support the Fox Cities Book Festival. The book festival is only possible because of our sponsors. There are many ways you can support the festival, and we thank you in advance for your donation. We ask that during the presentation today, our audience act as good digital citizens, respecting our speakers and each other, following this code of conduct. Any harassment or disrespectful behavior or language will be caused to remove you from today's event. During the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers using the Q&A functions on Zoom. You can type your questions there, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can in our time together. For those of you joining us on Facebook, you can leave your questions in the comments of the Facebook Live video, and we will be sure to be monitored during those. Now, it's my privilege to introduce you to our guest today for this wonderful panel. Mike Chen is a lifelong writer, from crafting fan fiction as a child to somehow getting paid for words as an adult. He has contributed to major geek websites and covered the NHL for mainstream media outlets. A member of FWA and Codex Writers, Mike lives in the Bay Area, where he can be found playing video games and watching Doctor Who with his wife and daughter and rescue animals. He is the author of Here and Now and Then, A Beginning at the End, and We Could Be Heroes. Thanks for being here, Mike. We also have Christina Sweeney-Baird, who was born in 1993 and grew up between London and Glasgow. She studied law at the University of Cambridge and graduated with a first in 2015. Her debut novel, The End of Men, was published in April 2021 by HarperCollins in the UK and by G.P. Putnam and Sons in April 2021. It is being translated into 16 languages, and the film rights have sold to a major US studio. Christina works as a corporate litigation lawyer in London and is currently working on her second novel. Christina, thank you for joining us. New York Times and USA Today bestselling author Jason Mott lives in southeastern North Carolina. He has a BFA in fiction and an MFA in poetry, both from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. He was nominated for a 29 Pushcart Prize Award, and Entertainment Weekly listed him as one of their 10 new Hollywood next wave people to watch. He is the author of 2 poetry collections and 4 novels, The Returned, The Wonder of All Things, The Crossing, and Hell of a Book, which is a finalist for the 2021 National Book Awards. Jason, thank you for joining us for the Fox Cities Book Festival. So we are here for the panel Reflections on Writing Fictional Pandemics panel. All of our authors here have written wonderful novels that feature pandemics of their own kind, and we wanted to gather you here today to discuss what that was like for you and how that has impacted your writing over the last couple of years. So let's dive in. Where were you when you realized our real life pandemic was going to be an event of historic proportions? And Mike, I see you're unmuted. Let's start with you.
So probably we were starting the publicity ramp up for my second book, A Beginning at the End, which is it's a post-pandemic like reconstruction story. And I right around, so this was released late January 2020. So we were doing the publicity ramp up in like November, December of that. And then around December, that's when you start to hear the news reports out of, the East of like, what's shutting down over there. And I remember thinking, well, this isn't going to be good, but hopefully it stays contained. But then I started to get some emails from readers of my debut novel who were saying that, like, oh, I pre-ordered your book, but I'm not going to read it yet because I'm feeling a little nervous right now. And I told them, like, that's totally okay. I get it. And then doing live events in January and February, and like as the news was unrolling in real time, I remember the very last one that I did. I thanked people for coming to hear me talk about a pandemic book as a pandemic was hitting. And I think when March, when things were like just totally shut down, like out here in California, and then soon, pretty much all over America and then globally in different regions, like, and then I started to see things that I wrote about that I thought was just good world building at the time, like starting to come true. And I got hate mail from someone accusing me of capitalizing on the pandemic, which they, clearly does not take this that long to do. So, and I'm going to pass this off right now because, okay, that's great.
Jason, do you want to pop in?
Sure thing. So I think it was probably in, I think March or April when I kind of started to realize that this was not the short-term thing that we all kind of hoped it would be. Mm-hmm. So one of my hobbies, I'm also a video gamer, by the way, Mike. But one of my other hobbies is I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It is a very up close and personal kind of hobby and a sport to kind of do. It's very coded to like wrestling, that kind of thing. And the gym that I go to, as the pandemic was happening, like there's a lot of invincibility mentality in that crowd of people. They're like, I'll be fine, just keep working out. And so we kept working out pretty long, like as things were going, as the pandemic was kind of growing and like things were beginning to shut down and business were beginning to close. The gym was one of the last places to be willing to close. And I kind of didn't think they would actually close. And then when they finally like shut the doors and said, no, we can't train anymore. That was the moment for me that I realized this was not going to be a fast event. And it was because of the fact that, like, again, that group of people is so hardcore about we're always going to be working out. Like no matter what happens, hurricane, I live in Southeastern North Carolina, like hurricanes come through and we're still at the gym training, and like it's kind of a stop for nothing mentality. And yet the pandemic brought all that to a screeching halt. So that was the time when I realized, oh, this is not just a passing thing.
What about you, Christina?
So I was like weirdly blasé about it for someone who had spent kind of over a year like researching and writing a pandemic novel. And actually my novel was out on submission. So I have these emails from my agent going with like articles to BBC News about what I think we're then calling like the Wuhan virus, going, this is quite weird. I wonder if this is going to have an impact. And I was like, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And then the book was purchased by publishers in early February 2020, when things still, at least in the UK, we all kind of saw it, I think, as something that was happening somewhere else that wasn't really going to affect us, which I think happened to a lot of people because it seems so scary that it's going to affect you as well. And then I remember it was kind of in March, suddenly like I had to self-isolate and was at home and like offices shut down and the book had already sold. And the one thing I did have is that weirdly I'd thought that pandemics probably wouldn't happen because having researched one and then written one that was so extreme, in my head, pandemics were a very fictional thing. But then having researched it, I remember when people were saying, oh, it's going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and they were just taking home a few papers from the office. I did think, no, if we're heading home, like this is going to be the long haul. And that I didn't say that, don't worry, I wasn't kind of freaking everyone out around me. But I did think in my head, like, oh God, no, if this is actually happening, we're going to be lucky if we kind of get out of this in a couple of years. And then I had the very surreal experience of editing a pandemic novel while the pandemic was happening, like writing an author's note saying, you know, I hope you and your families are well, and trying to assure people. So I think, you know, Mike's touched upon that I hadn't capitalized on the pandemic. And it was like, no, my imagination was here last year and unfortunately reality's caught up. And that it was the most surreal time, I think, for all of us. Like I think for anyone, right, living through something you expect to not happen in real life is a bizarre experience. And then adding in the fact that you've lived in this fictional version of it as well, just kind of adds a layer of surrealness to it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to hear from you about how it was playing out during your editing and, you know, finalizing process of your book. For all of you, what was your first thought really regarding your novels? You know, Mike, we heard from you about readers' responses, but how did it hit differently? You were experiencing the pandemic as a person and then also experiencing it as a writer and a creative. You know, what did you think about regarding your novels during that time?
I'll go first because I'm unmuted and then I'll mute myself for a wee while. I think for me, the biggest thing was for your own sanity, if you're editing, I think I kind of needed to keep them quite separate. Quite a lot of people have asked me like, oh, did you adjust things in the book as things are happening in real life to make them closer connected? And if anything, I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted this fictional world I'd invented where 90% of the world's men die within like that, to stay very fictional and to stay separate from the world, you know, where I was trying to kind of cope day to day. So my editor and I had a lot of discussions about it and we kept COVID out of the book. We didn't make any references to it. We kept it in its this parallel universe. And actually the only change I made was that originally the pandemic in my book was caused by a pangolin. And back in March, April, we all thought, I think that it was definitely like a pangolin that had caused it. And my editor said, you're going to have to change that because people will think you've stolen that from real life, not the other way around. And also there was a lot of lottery ticket jokes and Cassandra references. So I changed it to like a monkey causing the pandemic virus, but otherwise tried to keep them separate.
I had the very like surreal experience of, because I did most of my editing in like late 2018, early 2019, and I had actually put the book away. So, you know, I was working on the next thing. And so I actually hadn't revisited it until I think I listened to the audiobook in April, because around like March, April, I think people had started to gravitate towards pandemic media at that time. And I think it was when people started to realize that like this is going to be with us a while, like they kind of some people sought some comfort in entertainment of like, how are we going to get through this? And I got, instead of the hate mail that I got some really nice messages, because my book is really built on like the optimism of community in the face of tragedy. And so I got some really nice messages about that. And I started to revisit it myself. And I listened to the audiobook and I thought, wow, this is really unnerving, because like I had these details that I totally forgotten about, like, you know, there's hand sanitizer everywhere. There's like air filters installed in offices. There's like social isolation, like all sorts of agoraphobia and things like that. And so I'm like just re-experiencing it as a reader, because as authors, like we often just put our books away and, you know, the readers know it better than we do. So re-experiencing it that way, it it was really, really unnerving. And it was like week by week, another thing that I'd written just as like logical world building would come true. And I thought like, oh God. And then people started making jokes, about like, can you write a book about like universal healthcare or something to bring that to life next?
That's awesome. I had a pretty similar experience to Mike's experience, where I was fortunately working on a new project. And so there was this wall of kind of blocking out all the news and all the stuff that was going on to a certain degree, and kind of trying to avoid the reality of it. I think that's also, it wasn't just because of the book, that's also just my like human nature. Like I think we all were in denial for the longest period of time because it all seemed so surreal. And then as the lockdown kind of happened and we kind of got further along into it, I did kind of go back and revisit the book a little bit and was kind of pondering. I think for me, it was a very strange experience because the worry was, how bad is it going to get? And I just finished writing, when I wrote The Crossing, that was you spend a year or two writing a book about how bad it's going to get, and in The Crossing, it gets pretty terrible. And so there was a lot of worry and fear over that. I think that is interesting because I live in a very small, rural, kind of out of the way town, and it takes so long for things in bigger cities, like the shortages and like weird things like that, to actually affect us because we're such a small, kind of distant town. That I think that helped me not get too freaked out by it. But having written it, there's definitely a fear of like, where's the stopping point? Like, how bad is it going to get? How far does the slide go before we could start to kind of correct?
Mm. Yeah, and Jason, it was a surreal time, but I'm curious about all of you having to do research and really thinking through what a pandemic might look like, and having that thought experiment a bit earlier than all of the rest of us, and if you felt like that prepared you at all in any way, or if there were still just as many surprises for you as how this pandemic has played out.
I'll go since I'm already unmuted. For me, it was having written the Crossing and seeing the kind of reality of it. Even though it was a little bit scary, I was kind of buffered by the fact that like I was like, my brain kind of said it can never get as bad as you imagined it. No matter how bad it gets, you've imagined it worse than it's ever going to actually get. So things will be okay. So that actually was a saving grace for me because I think that's why pandemic novels and like dystopian novels exist. They're the author working through their worst fears and like trying to explore their fears and trying to like, assuage those fears. And so for me, having written that, I was like, well, it's never going to get this bad. So we're going to be okay. So that helped me out a lot, actually.
Yeah, Jason and Christina, I think it might be a toss-up between the two of you over whose pandemic was worse for future Earth or whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend 9 in 10 men dying in the space of 2 months. I don't think that would be good long term or indeed short term. Yeah, I found that it was definitely the same thing. I in my head I kind of had like, okay, well the reality is not how I wrote it, and that's helpful. But I definitely found that having researched them so much, I felt like my brain was actually trying to block out things. For example, like I kept reading when I was researching my book that there are 3 waves in any pandemic. There tend to be 3 key waves. So I found that very hard sometimes. For example, when we were in the UK, we had these kind of endless lockdowns, which on one hand I'm very grateful for, and on the one hand were very, very difficult. And I remember some of my friends saying, well, this is definitely it, guys. We're in the second wave and now we're going to be done. And in my head, I was like, statistically and historically, that is actually not the case. So it was very difficult on the one hand, balancing the research I'd done that was based in real life and science with the fictional book I'd written that was way worse than things we're ever going to get, with the fact that in real life, obviously things are uncertain in a way that they're not in fiction. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we've all enjoyed reading, I think, thrillers and dystopian thrillers so much recently. You get to read a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you get that resolution, when in real life at the moment, we are still very far away, or certainly closer now, but we've been pretty far away from resolution. So you can read Station 11 or whatever pandemic, novel in April 2020, and you get to finish it, close the book, and know that there was some sense where things were going. So I definitely found the kind of absence of any sense of what the plan was, or where we'd go next, or how bad things would get, or just what would happen next, very challenging. And I don't think necessarily having my fictional story with its nice ending helped.
So I it was one of those really strange things where like it felt like it helped and then it felt like it didn't. Like having written this, because I remember when I was doing the world building and I was just thinking like, okay, so how are people going to be unnerved? Because mine takes place like 2 years after like a massive quarantine and like a complete vaccination effort, and there's 2 billion people left in the world, and a lot of the survivors go to like major metropolitan areas because that's where the infrastructure still remains. And so the focus was on like the healing aspect of it. And so I was trying to think like, how would people heal after this? And there's a lot of, there's a lot of thinking through of like, because my book was supposed to be just a metaphor for trauma, for generational trauma and for individual trauma. And so that's where a lot of my research went into. I looked at a lot of like addiction type of stuff, and then also like family history type of trauma. So learning all about that and talking to people about that, I think didn't necessarily help from like a pandemic preparedness perspective, but from an understanding of where we are right now, and also like moving forward out of this, understanding that we are all going to be really, really, really messed up, even though, like so many of us, I think, are like on our day to day are okay, but like we're still, even if we're vaccinated, even if our families are vaccinated, like there's still that sort of like clinging on to, like we're still in survival mode. There's still like not a total certainty out of this yet. And I think knowing like the stages of grief and recovery that are going to come up in the conversations that we're going to have, hopefully with therapists, because therapy is awesome. I think like that's kind of like mentally prepared me for like what's going to probably happen over the next like probably 1 to 3 years for a lot of people.
That's really interesting. And yeah, so Mike Chen's novel, for those of you who are still working through the reading list, we get like a snippet at the beginning about the initial outbreak, but really it's the meat of the book is several years past this pandemic has happened. And so Mike, you talked about how you wanted to focus on the themes of healing and of this aftermath. Is that why you set it after the initial pandemic had taken place?
Yeah, exactly. Because I found the origin of this book actually was started about 10 years ago. It was actually from watching another apocalyptic show. I was watching The Walking Dead when it was like at its peak, and there's a scene in there in the second season where the mom Lori and the young boy Carl are like sitting on the farm, and the outbreak had just happened in the previous season, and she's trying to get her son to do math homework. And there were a lot of jokes on the internet at the time of like, who has to do homework during a zombie apocalypse? But I remember thinking that that's a very human instinct to try to like find and grasp onto normalcy wherever you can find it. And then it sparked this question in my head that I hadn't really seen too much in dystopian media, was what happens like if society doesn't actually end, if it just pushes to the brink and then pauses and then comes back. How do you unpack all that trauma? Like, how do you go about like learning math and other normal things? And that's the question that I really wanted to examine with this book, because I think we all, in big ways and little ways, experience trauma across our lives. And sometimes like that pauses us where we are. And then sometimes we manage to go the exact wrong way. And then sometimes we fight through it and become better people for it. And so that was really the whole metaphor for this book, was using the apocalypse as something like this. It wasn't meant to be a survival guide for the world, but here we are.
Yeah, and like Christina said, you can close a book, but we just keep going through this, and in your story, your characters keep experiencing this journey. And for all of you, so situations like pandemics and other global catastrophes, they really bring out the best and the worst in people. How did this impact how you built your characters and, saw both sides of these characters you were building?
I'll jump in. So like I said, for me, like I wrote the crossing before the pandemic kind of all happened, but it was based upon kind of looking back at previous, kind of flashpoints in human history and like in social cultural kind of history of like where these kind of traumatic events kind of occurred. And it's been interesting seeing the real world version of it. You get, I think for me, kind of thinking of like as looking at people and looking at characters, the thing that I find most interesting is the friction points aren't where I expected them to be. Like people became selfish way faster than I ever expected. You think of, or at least I tend to think of, post-apocalyptic things like, yes, there will be a point of like becoming selfishness, like that's just a given, but that's much farther down the line. Like that's the way, like when things are getting really bad. But like it took us no time, at least here in the US, to just sell out of everything, and like everyone's being really, it was very surreal. So I think that has kind of changed my opinion of how the human brain kind of acts and behaves. I won't say it's changing for the better. I think I was more optimistic before all that stuff happened. Now I'm like 2 or 3 degrees less optimistic about how people kind of interact with one another. So that was my kind of perspective on it.
Yeah, and I had a similar thing in terms of having written the book before the pandemic. Those characters already kind of fully formed on the page. And I suppose in my book, some governments maybe don't respond particularly well to the pandemic, and I'd say that was accurate in how things were in real life. But one thing I would say that I found very heartening was, so I have some characters in my book. So given the men are immediately at risk, you have kind of a woman who's a doctor, for example, and she wants to save her husband and her sons, and she works in the medical field, and she basically just kind of bails. She's like, nope, I'm done. I'm putting my family above everyone else. And what I found very heartening was that actually we found, I think, especially in the medical field, I have quite a lot of friends and family members who are in healthcare, and they just really like committed in a way that it goes, I think, just beyond, it goes way beyond a job. It goes way beyond a sense of responsibility to just this kind of superhuman commitment to helping other people. And that's been a pocket that I've kind of optimism that I think I've focused on when it has felt a bit like the world is falling apart around our ears. I have been very heartened by the fact that in real life, people, frankly, that are being often not paid nearly enough and are having a very difficult job to do have been working hospitals day in day out. And I've certainly found that when I'm like, oh, my day is really difficult because I'm like at my laptop at home in isolation, I've been like, get it together. It could, like, no, you are fine. You're doing just fine. It could be a lot worse. So that has been for me a pocket of optimism that I've clung to. I think it has felt a bit like people have been quite selfish.
I think I've kind of found like a complete mix of what Christina and Jason said, because it's I have found in my book, I kind of broke people off into like the people who, everyone is dealing with the fact that they can't deal with their trauma. And so some people splinter off into like conspiracy theories, which we're clearly seeing. Some people splinter off into like agoraphobia and shutting down, and some people splinter off into like this unhealthy push forward at all costs type of mentality. And I think we see that really because that's kind of like just basically how humans, like, we're built to cope with that. And then you have other factors like politics and economics and culture and religion and things like that. I was completely off on like my ratios of who would go where. I was hoping, more people would be in the like kind of messed up but want to do the right thing. So it's been interesting seeing even among like, like my small circle of people. Like I think what's heartening is most of the people that I associate with in my day-to-day life, and the people I call my good friends and my family, like most of them have chosen like the path of we're going to sacrifice for our community. So even though like far too many people, I think, chose the like, I'm going to buy all the toilet paper and screw everyone else type of route, it's been reinforcing, like, I guess, my own faith of like of choosing good people, to see that I did choose good people, and I can rely on them in times of crisis.
Yeah, and thinking about these cast of characters a little bit more, Christina, I have a question for you, because you were interested in writing about a world without men, and I believe in the back of your book you list the power as one of the things that got you started on this journey. And so the pandemic that you wrote into your novel really gave you a way to visualize this world and these problems and discussion points you were, dealing with. Like, what were your main takeaways and what were the main things you wanted to explore through doing that?
Yeah, so I sometimes say that I kind of wrote a pandemic novel by accident because I wanted to answer the question, kind of, what does the world look like without men, in a hyper realistic way, not in a Handmaid's Tale way, in a kind of, or like a reverse Handmaid's Tale. Like, genuinely, what would it look like if very quickly 90% of the world's men were at risk and then died? And so the pandemic was in many ways just the most realistic way for me to have that happen, to have that enormous gender imbalance happen in a way that felt to me realistic and like you believe it on the page. But so I think that one of the things that I found was that it was this incredibly interesting world building exercise that felt very fantastical when I was doing it. And obviously it still is very happily, the virus that I wrote about in my book is way worse than COVID has been, and we haven't had that gender imbalance. But I definitely had, I had an absolute kind of blast in terms of the intellectual stimulation of it, thinking through what, the entire world, what changes and what stays the same if you have this very specific issue. How does, everything as small as how does a hospital respond, for example, when you have these enormous gender imbalances between, for example, in the UK, like over 90% of nurses are women, but only over 90% of orthopedic surgeons are men. So suddenly you have like, how on earth do you deal with that? That's not an issue that you can like easily correct. But then going up to like the structures of parliament and how different countries would respond. It was really fun thinking all of those things through. And in many ways that the pandemic was kind of secondary to that thought experiment of, yes, but with this gender aspect, what changes and what stays the same, what would the world look like? And then how do you try and recover? The book is set over 6 years. So once you've kind of halted that complete apocalyptic decline and you have a vaccine, how do you then try and inch your way back to normality? And kind of touching on what Mike said in terms of the emotional aspects of that. One of my characters, for example, is someone whose husband and son died. Like, how that change has happened to you, but also to lots of other people, and your trauma actually isn't abnormal. And that's something that I think I've seen maybe more of a parallel with in real life that I couldn't have ever expected, which is that when hundreds of thousands or millions of people have been very, very, very unwell, or had loved ones who were very unwell, or lost loved ones, or suddenly it's not as unusual to have had that experience. Currently, if someone says they've been in the ICU, you're obviously still like, oh my God, that's awful, I hope you're okay. But it's not rare at the moment to meet someone who says, oh, I've been in the ICU in the last. So I found it quite interesting looking at the emotional fallout of what it's like when you have an experience in a pandemic context that should be enormous and crazy and everyone goes, oh my God, I can't believe that happened to you. But because it's happening to so many people, actually people's emotional response to it, I think, is quite different. So that's been a parallel, but otherwise it was kind of just this huge thought experiment that I then wound into a novel that, through characters that I hope people would find engaging.
Yeah, for all three of you, now that we've gone through a real life pandemic, and all of you had really finished your books before this began, is there something you wish you had thought to incorporate earlier to make it more realistic, or something that now you go like, that now I understand, or I wish I had put it in?
I think an early desperation for it to be over is something that it's such a human thing that we really just want to think that it's done. We're like, right, I have had enough now of this. This is awful. But the reality, so for example, in the UK, but the reason why we had, the government quite rightly telling us, no, you can't all meet, for example, in groups of more than 6 inside yet, is because it's still dangerous. So you have to have these kind of rules in place. I think probably I underestimated the extent to which people would need in that latter stage of a pandemic when things have been really grim for a long time, and maybe you have a vaccine, but you're still nowhere near the end. But yeah, you cannot trust the vast majority to necessarily do what is really hard and difficult and emotionally anathema to us, which is to kind of stay away from people. I think I probably would have had to insist on that a little more in my fictional world.
I often tell people that you can tell my book is science fiction because there's belief in science and there's competent government response. And I think dealing with that, I was just blown away at and I still am, at like the amount of people who refuse a very tested, very researched vaccine. And there's like multiple forms of it. And there's so much data to show that like, hey, this works. This will like 95% chance like keep you healthy. And like in my book, like when there's like so there's internationally coordinated like quarantine zones established, which, you know, clearly like we cannot get along with, like, you know, we're America and we can't get along with our neighboring countries, so like, that's not going to work like overseas and stuff. So but then also thinking about like the amount of people in my book who are like, you know, they're busing people to these quarantine zones that are like stadiums and prisons and all these other like just mass areas that, you know, you can keep people like contained and safe. And people are going because they're thinking this is how we're going to save our lives and our families' lives until we can get a vaccine. And the people who choose not to do that isn't because they're anti-vaccine, it's because they're like anti-government and they want to try to survive on their own. So it's a little bit different from like the anti-establishment vibe that you get right now, where people are just like, you know, I don't believe in science. So I think like I could have incorporated that more, and there definitely is like moments for that type of conflict to actually exist in my book. But I think like even that was probably too dark for me. You know, there's the joke of like, you know, in a horror movie, there's always like the one scientist who's like, if we don't do this, we're all going to die, and everyone laughs at him. And you think like, it's a horror movie. This is never going to happen in real life. And of course, we're here now. So I'm totally missed that.
Yeah, I think yeah, similar response to both of these. I think the desire for it to be over and how powerful that desire can be, and like how much that influences people's decision making, I think that's something that I could not have expected or predicted. And I also think kind of following Mike, kind of echoing what Mike said, like I'm saying a little bit more cynical way though, like the ability of people to make terrible decisions and to like make decisions against their own well-being. But of course, the irony is, if you write that, people think, oh, these characters aren't believable and no one behaved this way. It's like, you know, kind of to borrow the horror movie kind of, you know, kind of metaphor. It's like there's that moment in the horror movie where they're in the house and the killer comes through the door and like the person runs upstairs and you're like, why are you running upstairs? Run out the front door, like stay on ground level, like don't run upstairs. That's where you get murdered. And if it turns out like we have millions of people who just run upstairs, and it's like, why do you do that? And, you know, when you watch it in a horror movie, you're screaming at the television saying, why are you making these terrible decisions that you're obviously going to pay for? And yet here we are in 2021 and people are making very similar decisions with their own personal health. And that baffles me. So I'm still trying to decompress and like kind of unpack all that.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jason. Like, I think me and all the participants watching as readers, when we're reading a book, we're like, oh, we want it to be realistic and everything. But then with what we're seeing in real life, it is an eye-opener in just the change and how complex human behavior really is. And, you know, thinking about pandemic novels generally, there's a pretty long history of pandemic novels, things like Station 11 and Stephen King's The Stand. I reread The Stand last year. I don't know what I was thinking. But one thing that I really noticed was that nobody was wearing masks in The Stand. And I thought, you know, if only they had known about masks, maybe things would have ended up differently for them. But where do you think writers of future pandemic novels will fall? Do you think we'll see pandemic novels coming out in the next decade, or is this a subgenre that has to go dormant for a while?
I do think we'll see fewer. I remember I did an essay on pandemic fiction in December last year for The Guardian, and I was talking to someone and I made a comment about how there was that these would be the last pre-pandemic pandemic novels. Like there is an enormous difference between writing about something that obviously can happen, but nonetheless you're writing about it in a fictional world that has happened. So by all means, this is obviously conjecture, despite many accusations to the contrary. I'm not Cassandra, but I do think that it will be maybe less interesting for someone fictionally to explore you know, an alternative pandemic when we've been living through a pandemic, because fundamentally it's kind of been there, right? Like, it's, you know, you don't have to do the world building in the same way. Emotionally, a lot of us have been living through it. I think there's a separate question maybe as to whether there'll be novels that try and kind of explore the experience of COVID, which is, I suppose, a different thing to me in my head, because that just feels like something exploring the experience of 2020 and 2021, as opposed, you know, a novel about a time, a period of time, as opposed to a novel about pandemics. But yeah, I can only imagine that there will be fewer pandemic novels that truly kind of, to me, do something like Station 11 did, which is just, this is like extraordinary imaginative experience, because it will just require less imagination. But then again, I'm sure that someone will prove me wrong and create some kind of incredible world that somehow explores COVID-19 and nonetheless makes it an alternative world.
I found like I've gotten asked this question pretty much for like every publicity hit for this book. And the more I think about it, because I have several friends who released their pandemic novels like within like the same 6 months, and like we were requested to be on panels together to explore like, you know, fictional pandemics as like a science and, you know, things like that. And I think we all had the same vibe, like from our readers in particular, was like they got something out of this, but I think it was like, you know, they were kind of ready to like let it go for a little bit. And I think it's probably the same reason why like my wife and I stopped watching dark TV shows. Like all we watch is like Star Trek reruns, because it's like our comfort zone, and that's probably going to be like next 5 years. It's just going to be nothing but Deep Space Nine and Voyager on a loop in our house. And I think like for creatives, we're going to have these themes of isolation and fear and like constant anxiety and passing down anxiety to our children. I think that's going to incorporate into like so many different like creative aspects, like music and art and writing and like filmmaking and all this stuff. But I think like the appetite, like the commercial appetite for a publisher to say like, yes, I want a pandemic novel because, you know, we've all just gone through this, let's relive it. You know, I don't think there's going to be that sort of like commercial investment into it, and probably not for like 5 to 10 years, but it's going to influence, it already has influenced all of our arts. Like even my book coming out in January, like I didn't mean for it to be anything about this. It's about alien abduction, but like I can see the creative decisions that I made during the editing process were like feelings of isolation and panic and stuff like that are in there, and you don't even think about it. So I think that's really going to just like creep into all of our media as we process as a culture for the next few years.
Yeah, I kind of feel pretty similar, but I think it will go dormant for a little while, but then I think it's going to come back in force. And I also think that there will still be, I think the appetite for like dark stories and like very kind of dystopian, like very, very heavy stories is actually going to grow because of all of this. Because I think a lot of what's happening is there are people, the last few years are going to be interpreted different based upon what generation you are and where you are in your age cycle, like how old you are basically. Because for people like, so I'm 43, I think people my age, like I also have, you know, deep dive back into Deep Space Nine and Star Trek and all that kind of good stuff, because, you know, it's comfort food. It gets my head out of the reality that we're living through. But then you've got young people, you know, teenagers, people of that age for who this is part of their formative experience. For better or worse, it is very much a part, like this state that we're living in, this kind of like this changed environment for them is going to be somewhat normalized. And so the stories that they tell are going to come out of that place where this is a somewhat normal kind of place to be in. So you're going to have these stories that are heavier and that are darker and that are more cynical, I think. Doesn't that, and I don't think this is all a bad thing. I think it's going to be a case where like the decision makers, producers, editors, people that are making the decisions right now are of my age bracket and older. They're going to put thumbs down on this kind of genre for a while, because for them, this is out of their comfort zone. This isn't the normal world. But I think 15, 20 years or so, you're going to have a massive upswell of like stories that are working in this space, because you're going to have people who are teenagers now and kids now suddenly developing writing skills and artistic skills and able to actually create a voice. And that voice is going to be trying to interpret what's happening now. So I think it's going to dip for a while. It's going to come back in mass. It's going to be an entirely different kind of genre. The way the genre works will be entirely different than it is now.
Quick tackling onto what Jason was saying, it's kind of like how if you look at like all the music trends, like they always reflect something from like 20 years ago. I think he's spot on that like when that generation of creatives like matures and gets access to like the commercial aspect of entertainment, it's going to hit hard, and there's going to be a lot of reflection on that generation.
Yeah, that's an interesting consensus you all have, that, you know, we will be seeing the lingering effects of this in different ways. I guess we will have to have a reconvening in 10 years, you know, to see what has happened. For everyone participating, we are going to start organizing those question and answer spot in just a moment. So go ahead now and type in your questions so we can get them answered. But switching gears a little bit, for all of you as writers, how did the pandemic impact your writing time and creative energy?
I found I had a lot of time. So I'm 28 and I don't have kids. So I wasn't happily kind of homeschooling. But I found that it was really stultifying. I found that being in the same, I live in London, and normally everything's just kind of go, go, go all the time in a way that I really enjoy. I normally travel a lot, and I'm going to the theater a lot and just like seeing things and people. And I work full time. Part of the reason of that is because I like going out and interacting with people. I find that in the same house the whole time, I found incredibly difficult. And I had a draft that wasn't very good of my new novel, which happily has kind of been left behind. Better pastures have been reached with that particular draft. But at one point I said to my agent, I was like, I just feel like it's a lot of people in rooms talking about stuff. And she was like, well, yeah, but all we kind of know at the moment is people in rooms talking about stuff. So I definitely found that it just was so difficult to write interesting, engaging, thoughtful fiction for me, when I just felt like everything that I normally have that inspires me and kind of fills my creative cup wasn't there. And I don't find that like Netflix, I don't find that watching things for me has the same creative impact for me. It's like reading and seeing people and going to art galleries. That's the stuff that really kind of enriches my brain. So yeah, lots of time, but not nearly as productive and efficient and actually writing good work as I would like. I found it's been a lot easier once things have been, in the UK at least, a bit more normal over the last few months.
So as you can see, my daughter poked in a few times here. It's been incredibly difficult because I know in like, you know, 100, 200 years ago, you know, there are plenty of times when like you're around your kids all the time and you're like trying to raise them while you're like working the farm or whatever. But our society is not built around that right now. So I have a day job, and then, you know, I have, you know, so many deadlines, and my wife has her things that she needs to do. And then we're suddenly like teachers too, and like when we still are, like California is still offering a remote option, and we decided to like just be extremely safe until she can get vaccinated. So this is horrible. It's so hard. I have the one good thing that I take away with this is that I have learned to sprint in my writing. So in like 15 to 30-minute segments, and then throughout the day, I kind of make mental notes on like Google Docs on my phone of like, these are the things that I want to outline and hit when I actually sprint. And then because even when my daughter goes to bed, like the amount of energy there is just not there. And also finding other writers who are also parents of young children, and we're all trying to juggle together, and like meeting them on Twitter and like becoming a community of like, even if we don't write in the same genre, but like we're all facing the same obstacles, and so that sort of community has been really nice too. But it sucks. Let's not do this again.
All right, there we go. Okay, cool. So I'm going to be the dissenting voice here. And so like, it's been pretty awesome, honestly. It's becoming less awesome now, but like all of 2020, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, obviously the world was not awesome, but my writing and productivity was freaking phenomenal during that period. I'm a stay-at-home kind of person anyway. Like I'm a very much an isolated kind of person anyway. So for me, as far as my writing schedule goes, that like the pandemic didn't change any of that, or like how I found my creative voice. Like none of that was really impacted by COVID or anything like that, because I stay at home and I meet some friends from occasion. Like that's where my creative space kind of happens. Now I will admit that. So now here we are in October 2021. And what's happening now is like I need some adventure. Like I need interactions. I need to get, one thing I like to do is like I've always done is like I'll get in my car and just kind of literally get lost, like just pick a direction and drive and just get lost for like 2 days and just kind of see things and see people and stop at weird stores and like have things happen. And so obviously in COVID, you can't really do that. You're starting to be able to do it a little bit, but it's all very strange. And so luckily, like just when I was kind of getting dried up as far as I won't say creatively dried up, but those experiences, those adventures that I need to kind of spur my writing, I'm able to kind of see friends again. All my friends are vaccinated, thankfully, and we're able to kind of meet again and like have conversations which spur creative thoughts and all that kind of good stuff. But the initial phase, like the initial part of COVID, like I got so much done, and it was normal for me because I'm used to not seeing people. So it totally worked out.
And Jason, let's keep thinking of some of that awesomeness with our next question. What's one way you think society can emerge in some better way from the pandemic for all of you?
Well, I'll jump on this one.
Yeah.
So one thing that has changed for me, changed for the positive for me, is I'm learning to really value the time with friends and family more. We're like, now that we're, after not seeing each other for like, I've got friends I haven't seen like a year to a year and a half, and we just saw each other again about a month ago for the first time since March of 2020. And it was the most enriching kind of thing that I've had in a while. And like, at the end of the night, like we all agree, like every 3 months, we're going to have the same kind of get together. Like it's on our schedules now. And like, we're actually like blocking off time. Like we are, and we all live within driving distance, and we would go for, 6-7 months without seeing each other because life gets in the way. But now post COVID, it's like, we're not letting life get in the way. I'll say post COVID because we're still in it, but like, we're not letting life get in the way anymore. Like there's a more active attempt at engagement and kind of enrichment, and like remembering that we're important to each other and like we matter in each other's lives, and we're going to maintain that more actively. So that's been one of the great things for me.
I think there's two takeaways that I have as a society. And I think the first is COVID really, really highlighted like the economic inequity on so many levels. Like the people who, are our front line, like we hold little parades for them and we tweet nice things about them, but we're not giving them protective equipment. We're not giving them time off to work or time off to get vaccinated or things like that. And I think this really just highlighted like, there's such a stark disparity. Like I work in the tech industry for my day job, and like all of us, like we're just doing the exact same job at home. We're in Zoom instead of boardrooms. But like there's so many people where like they've still got to meet face to face with people. They've still got to they've got to deal with harassment and like just so many terrible things. And we don't have like the safety nets in society to help them and to protect them. And that's terrible. And I think like that's gotten so much visibility now. And I think we know that because of technology, we have an infrastructure where we can actually help them if we invest in it and if we raise awareness of it. So the flip side, the really positive side to that is like that infrastructure. So one of the coolest thing, the silver lining to all of this is that my daughter met one of her best friends through Zoom. Like she's her parents are writers, and like I know them, and we always thought like, hey, this would be really cool. Like if we ever went and did a con in LA, like we can get our kids together because they like Adventure Time and they both like all this other stuff that only they like. And then about a year ago, we thought like, well, why don't we just let them like watch these movies that only they like? Let's let them watch it together. And now they get together like every 1 to 2 weeks. They play on Zoom for like 4 hours, and like they're begging us to play Animal Crossing together on Nintendo Switch. And like they have this amazing connection, hopefully like a lifelong relationship where, hopefully they can go to Comic-Con together and everything when they're a little bit older. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't all turned to this online infrastructure that was already there, but we didn't really harness before. So technology is kind of like our savior and like our own black mirror at the same time.
Yeah, I think for me, there's one that springs to mind that's more personal, and one that's more societal. For me, the personal thing was weirdly the arts. Like, it just felt so enormous. Like, I went to the ballet for the first time. It was the Royal Opera House, kind of Royal Ballet's first performance since, like, the fact that arts organizations have just had such a difficult time, and so many of them have survived through just this extraordinary time. And like Station Level is a favorite book of mine, which obviously hits such a big theme in that, is the fact that kind of culture is still so important to us, especially when times are difficult. For me personally, kind of really appreciating the fact that just going to the theatre is actually not just going to the theatre. It is this extraordinary experience where people whose career is very happily having this amazing craft that they then come together to share with people who get to go and sit in a theatre together and have this collective experience. That for me has been huge to kind of get to go back to. And then I think on a societal level, vaccines, like, one thing that I was looked into was how long would it take to create a vaccine to a novel virus? And the answer for all the research I did was a pretty long time. And I remember worrying actually that people that knew about science would read my book and be like, I think she's been a little speedy here. And I actually went to a lecture given by Kate Bingham, who ran the vaccine task force in the UK, and hearing her talk for an hour about how on earth you went in literally like the middle of this kind of awful apocalypse, creating this vaccine. By all means, a lot of the work had been done before, but just the extraordinary work that was done, and how much preparation there is now moving forward, that if there is, God forbid, something like this again, that we're in a much, much better place with vaccines, and that we would be able, I think, to kind of have a similarly quick rollout, hopefully. The fact that we're all sitting here vaccinated, I got my vaccine, 6 months ago. Like, that is extraordinary. Time-wise, having that in the space of like 12 months post the start of an enormous pandemic is just extraordinary. So I think that's something I found amazing and slightly surreal in a really good way. And hopefully moving forward, we will all never again have quite the same fear of pandemics, if only because, I'm saying that very hopefully, I'd love for this to really be a once in a like many generations experience that someone can write about in like 400 years time. But if they do come up again, I think that vaccine wise, we're a lot more prepared now, which can only be a good thing.
Good. So we've been talking about pandemics, but more and more we start talking about space travel and getting off of planet Earth in the news this year. And so, Jason, I have a question for you, because your novel, The Crossing, that's a major goal of your two main characters, to be, to go to this launch where they're, going to one of Jupiter's moons, Europa. Have you wrote a novel about pandemics and the space element, and now we're seeing that in the news. What do you think of the rise of space travel that we've been seeing in the news this year?
I think it's interesting. I have a lot of complex feelings about Jeff Bezos and that Elon Musk and the whole situation with that. So I'll give the shorter answer. The shorter answer to all that is, as much as space travel is very important, and space research is by all means, I would argue, one of the most important things we need to be doing. Billionaires throwing money at bragging rights just irks me in so many different ways. Like, there's so many more things they could be doing with that money. And again, and this is not to say that we don't need, because I think NASA is woefully underfunded. Like, I'm a big proponent of funding the sciences, and this includes, the space sciences. The crossing, the characters are obsessed with this trip to Europa because there's a theory, and this is a real world theory, that there may be an ocean underneath the surface of Europa where their life could actually exist. And that's something I've been fascinated with for decades. And so I would love it if NASA had the funding to really make that kind of a thing happen, and sooner rather than later. But as far as just rich people building rockets to go up in space and have bragging rights, like, that drives me insane. That is hedonism and selfishness at its maximum amount, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion.
As Roxanne Gay said somewhat cuttingly on Twitter, I think a few days ago, it's not even space, it's pre-space, which I really enjoy.
there is different levels of quality to space travel. And you know, I think reading all three of your novels were very interesting because, you know, you're looking at the pandemics, but you're also looking at the human elements. And I think all three of you have written into your novels so much about humans and humanity and how we can do better in these hard times, and you know, themes of hope, even, you know, with all of these difficult things. So our last question is, the last year and a half has been very challenging, but there have also been beautiful moments. And can you each share with us something beautiful that happened despite the pandemic?
I'll go first. I weirdly got to spend a lot of time with my granddad. I came back up to Scotland, where I'm from, and I kind of went off to uni in Cambridge, which is in UK terms very far away. I think in US terms it's not nearly as far away. It's like 400 miles. But you know, it's like a 4.5, 5 hour train journey. And I just never got to see him as often as I'd like to. And so I got to see him kind of every week. We'd sit in his garden. He lives on his own. And I would turn up with groceries and we'd chat. And that's been one of those very small but very human things that was really lovely. And also separately, I read, I think, about 150 romance novels when things were really grim. I was just like, do you know what? I need to just exist in like 1809 and see what Duke is going to get with like what Viscountess now. Like I'm done. So on a small superficial level, that was also pretty fun.
I'll go back to like my point with my daughter and her friend. I think like it's strange to have such a positive, life-changing experience for someone so young because of something like this. For me, on a personal level, I had seen every Star Trek series except Voyager. My wife had seen every Star Trek series except for Deep Space Nine. So we came up with like watch lists of how to get through them and skip the bad episodes, and we showed each other. And so now she loves Cisco, I love Janeway, you know, and we have solidified our Star Trek family together.
Awesome. I love Mike's whole family. I'm gonna say salamander episode is all I'm gonna say about Voyager. I think for me, the beautiful thing about the pandemic has been, even as much as I'm a very isolated person, this particular isolation has kind of made me really value the connections that we do have with each other. And because I have a friend who we used to rarely ever talk on the phone because I just don't like talking on the phone. But then with the quarantine and the fact that we knew we could never meet in person, for X amount of time, we began these like almost daily phone calls. Like we go for like an hour to an hour and a half, which is very, very much an anomaly for me. But he and I just reconnected in a way that we actually had not in a long time. Because we would always save up those conversations for like, oh, we'll get together in like a month and we'll just save it up for that, or 2 months, we'll save it up for that. And it became this case where it's like, no, why save it up? Why not just talk about things like 2 or 3 times a week and actually have these? So there was a lot of depth that kind of happened over that period. So that was a really cool experience for me.
Yeah, well, thank you all for sharing about so many different sides of your work and different facets of your novel. We are going to wrap up, but me and the rest of the board of the Fox Cities Book Festival was just so grateful to bring you all together and share this with our community. So thank you for your time today. And for everybody at home who joined us for today's event, thank you. We are finishing today with the Fox Cities Book Festival. There are 2 more events, one with Gavin Schmidt, and then we also have Jason back later this evening to be the final event for the festival. You can get links for that at foxcitiesbookfestival.org or just go to our events page on Facebook. If you would like to support future festival events, free and open to the public, we encourage you to make a donation. A link to learn more about donating is in the chat of this presentation. We ask that you take a brief survey to provide your feedback as we begin planning for the 2022 festival season. This link is also in the chat and will be emailed to you following the event. So Jason, Christina, Mike, thank you so much for participating and being with us today. All right. Well, bye all.